Here we are in a good evening to discuss the whole question of religion in public life in America. It's a good year to do it because this is the 30th anniversary of the publication of a great book by the late Richard John Newhouse called The Naked Public Square. And Newhouse had a key insight that if you had a public square from which religion was removed and you couldn't even talk about it, it wasn't a situation of neutrality, it was a situation of nakedness. And he made that point powerfully 30 years ago. It's also a good time to have this because yesterday was the National Day of Prayer. And I suppose it's a little bit like Mother's Day. Every day of the year should be Mother's Day. Every day of the year should be a day of prayer. But I suppose once a year it's good to actually recognize it. So here we are to discuss this with two gentlemen whom I've had the pleasure of interviewing before. And that leads me to just make one humble suggestion. If you could all, we're going to ask a lot of questions if you keep the answers short, which is almost an impossible thing to ask of a college president and a U.S. senator.
21 hours per answer, all right?
Exactly. So on average. So let me start with President Sloan, because when we talked about 3 years ago, interviewed him, here's one of the interesting things he said. It is a shame that in academic life, which is supposed to be marked by open-ended inquiry, people, both right and left, are often dogmatic. Evolution was a dogma for some, almost like a religious faith that could not be questioned. So first question for me, how are you trying to make HBU a place with this difficult combination, a place of religious faith with some items unquestioned, but also open-ended inquiry?
I think it's in the nature of the Christian faith that we hold both of those in tension. In the first place, we have a great confession: Jesus Christ is Lord. He's Lord over all things visible and invisible. So when you make that confession, you simultaneously assert, you confess, and yet, because it's a confession of faith, you also submit yourself to that. So that the very presupposition of the confession that He is Lord is that we are not. And so we humble ourselves. It's a confession made in worship. It's a confession made on the knees. It's a confession, therefore, that assumes that our own sinfulness, it demands humility of us. And so we always have to make the confession and always be very cognizant of the fact that we can be mistaken and that we often are mistaken. And so again, both confession, worship, confidence in the truthfulness of Scripture and the Lordship of Christ is by our very confession coupled with a humility that says, I'm willing to listen. I've got to be open to the truth. All truth is God's truth, and I've got to be open to it.
So awareness of our own sinfulness yields humility before God.
It ought to.
Ted, when we first met, I think in 2005, it was when you joined very generously a committee of several professors at the University of Texas, where I was teaching at the time. We were trying to create a program in Western civilization and American institutions, a program that was balanced rather than propagandistic, as much to the shock of some of you, the University of Texas courses often tend to be. That program got a tiny foothold, but then was washed out to the Gulf of Mexico. When you look at American higher education and the role of religion in colleges and what kids are taught about it, what do you see? Good news, bad news?
Bad news if you look at higher academics, but good news if you look at the American people. Listen, much of the academy has been captured by the far left, and there is this orthodox teaching that is secular in nature, that teaches one particular worldview, and that does not admit debate. You know, some years back, about a decade ago, I had the interesting experience of being invited to give the commencement address at the University of California, Berkeley,
Right.
at their School of Government.
Friendly territory for you.
Indeed, it was, well, and when the students found out I was coming, they were thoroughly dismayed, and they began protesting. And my wife, Heidi, her immediate response, she said, oh goodness, you're not nearly important enough to protest. Which may be the first role of any good spouse is instilling humility whether you want it or not. And it was interesting. I gave a lot of thought about what to say. You're going out to Berkeley as a conservative and what the message should be. And the entire theme of that commencement address was intellectual diversity. And the message was, listen, Berkeley has a wonderful tradition of passionate involvement in the issues of the day, of protest, of civic involvement, and I encourage the students, don't lose that passion. Don't lose the fire you have right now to go and change the world. But if you ever hope actually to persuade someone on the other side, you've got to understand how someone of good morals can look at the exact same issue that you care so passionately about and come to the opposite conclusion. So often in the public debate, those on the other side are caricatured as either stupid or evil. You're either too dumb to know the right answer, or even worse, you know and you just want people to suffer. And the point I tried to say to the students is, listen, whether in law or business or politics or life, if you want to convince someone, you need to understand how your mother could look at the issue that you care most about, come to 180 degrees the opposite position, and then make an argument appealing to common values. And that, I don't know that it persuaded anybody. I will confess, though, that I did try to include a number of jokes, and it was kind of amusing. You could see the students in the student body, and there was probably 4,000 or 5,000 people there. It was in this huge Greek amphitheater that actually prompted me to begin the whole thing with, friends, Romans, countrymen, lend me your ears. And you would see these students in the front row with their arms crossed, snarling. And I'd try to pick whoever looked the angriest, and if I had an even halfway decent joke, I'd try to deliver the punchline right to the angriest student. And you'd see them over and over again. They'd crack up laughing, and then they'd catch themselves. I'm not laughing at you.
I once, let me say, had an experience back in the 2000 campaign when there was a lot of talk of compassionate conservatism. And I was giving a speech at Washington University in St. Louis, and there was a whole row full of attractive young ladies who all had on T-shirts saying, I'm a compassionate conservative. And I thought, wow, this is finally catching on, this is terrific. But then when I started speaking, they turned around, and on the back of the T-shirt was, I'm a compassionate conservative because I'm a racist, bigot, intolerant, horrible person, and so forth. So anyway, I just recommend that to you as a...
That sounds a little bit like the U.S. Senate.
Well, let me ask on that. You've described the U.S. Senate dining hall, where some folks won't eat lunch with you, as somewhat like the Mean Girls movie. Now, which is a great line, and I believe it. When you think about your very interesting 16 months so far, you've made a lot of enemies. Are any of them unnecessary enemies?
As much as possible, I'm trying not to focus on Washington. I'm trying to focus on the job I was elected to do, which is to represent 26 million Texans. We've got enormous challenges in this country. We're facing fiscal and economic challenges. We're facing stagnant growth. We're facing an administration that is consistently infringing on the constitutional rights of Americans. And so my approach, Marvin, I mean, every senator there, Republican or Democrat, I've never spoken an ill word of any senator. I've never spoken to any senator with anything other than civility and respect. But that doesn't mean I'm going to refrain from doing my job. It doesn't mean I'm going to refrain from speaking the truth. And frankly, rather than listen to the party bosses in Washington, the people I'm trying every day to listen to are the men and women who are here, the men and women who it's my job to help provide a voice in Washington and help try to turn this country around.
Okay, so I ask this question because sometimes we think of Christianity or the Bible as a manual of some sort, or a list of policy proposals, or a list of this. But of course, I mean, as I suspect, I mean, you and Bob and most of you know, I mean, the real centerpiece of the Bible is about a person, and a person who acts with vigor and seriousness and wants to see change, but also with remarkable grace and tact and care for individuals. And so, Bob, I know when you were at that Cow College down the road, I think the name is Baylor, as I recall, and you may recall that also. There was a dispute involving the teaching of evolution. There was a new Polanyi Center for Intelligent Design that was created, and there was a huge amount of controversy. A lot of the professors who were there didn't like it, and the director was a person who was both very smart and cared about this a whole lot, but he eventually had to leave because I think this was the official verdict, that he lacked collegiality. And so this is important. I mean, I take that very seriously. It's important for Christian statesmen to not only have the right set of policies, but also reflect a little bit of Jesus in the way they act towards other people. So when you think back about your Baylor experience, I mean, let me ask the same question I was asking Ted. You know, there are necessary enemies, there are unnecessary enemies. When you think back, were all the enemies that, as you tried really to change Baylor and move it into a good position in the 21st century, when you look back, are they all necessary enemies, or are there some unnecessary enemies?
Well, I'm certain there had to have been some unnecessary enemies, because I'm a fallen creature, and I look back on any experience in life, and I can assure you I've made many mistakes, failed to understand appropriately, and failed to communicate well. I think the main thing to do is do your best to acknowledge, mistakes you've made, and go on. Ask the Lord's forgiveness, ask other people's forgiveness to the best extent you possibly can. And but honestly, when I read, say, a passage like 1 Corinthians 4, I think there's we live in a post-Freudian age which spends a lot of time on introspection and so on. I think as Christians we also need to have, with humility, a certain robust conscience. And that is, I think it's perfectly legitimate to say, look, here's what I believe. I don't have to apologize for what I believe. This is who I am, and I want to live with integrity and faithfulness and collegially and bring people along. But our Lord also had very harsh words at times for religious leaders of his day. He had harsh words at times for his own disciples. And so I think what ought to matter to us beyond anything else is, the first commandment is love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength. The second is love your neighbor as yourself. And love in Scripture is closely correlated to the word truth. It's closely correlated to the word courage. And so I think in the political arena, or in any arena of life, we have our convictions. We stand by what we say, which we must try to live those things out courageously. Yes, along the way, we are going to make unnecessary enemies, and it's a shame we do. But on the other hand, I don't think you can live life with regret. I don't think you can live life always looking back. And I don't think you can live life with a kind of morbid self-introspection. We're a people of faith, not fear. We say, here's who we are. We're Christian people. We believe that the gospel can be preached freely in a free land. We believe that the truth is the truth, and we ought to live by it and move forward with courage.
I appreciate what you're saying. It's a little bit like NaCl, sodium chloride. Each being a poison by itself, but you put them together and you have salt. So truth and love. It's a hard combination. But Ted, let me ask. I was reading something from Tom Coburn, who said that if he wanted to take a trip somewhere, and as I suspect many of you know, Tom Coburn is a very conservative senator, very pro-life, person of great integrity. But he was saying that if he was going to take a trip somewhere, he would like to go with Chuck Schumer, a very liberal Democratic senator from New York. Who would you like to take a trip with?
Well, I can answer it by telling you the last trip I did take. So rather than speak hypothetical, the last trip I took abroad was a trip to South Africa for Nelson Mandela's funeral. And on that trip, that was about half of the Congressional Black Caucus. And it was all Democrats. It was only me and one other Republican who went. I thought it was a crying shame there were not more Republicans on the trip. But it was an interesting, if I remember correctly, it was 19 hours there on the plane, 19 hours back, with a plane full of African-American Democrats who don't see entirely eye to eye with me on every issue of policy. And you know, I'll tell you, it was actually delightful. We laughed a lot, we had some conversations, and you know, I don't know that anyone was convinced, but it was, I'll tell you, the most wonderful part of the trip was getting to spend some time with John Lewis, who is a civil rights legend, who stood on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial with Dr. Martin Luther King when the I Have a Dream speech was given. And John Lewis was beaten with batons and dogs protesting as a young man, and just sitting listening to him. I tried to spend a great deal of time just asking John, tell me what it was like to be facing, when you face, he told me this powerful story of going to Montgomery where he had been beaten, and subsequently, I mean, decades later, being given by the police chief a badge from the Montgomery Police Department, which, when the same police department decades earlier had been beating him, it was a powerful story of the journey this country's made. And that was a wonderful opportunity to get to know him and to hear his courageous stand.
So Bob, as you think of your experience, again, let me just ask once about that college down the road. You know, where you had, I think, 10, you know, really terrific years of putting Baylor in the position, in the direction it's going now. What is there something that you did wrong?
You know, it doesn't take long to answer that. I thought that comment earlier about fallen creature in a fallen world pretty well handled that. Yeah, you know, I wish I had done quite a few things differently, but you know, again, you know, Marvin, I don't spend too much time thinking about that. I try to. Certainly, we should all learn from our mistakes and so on. But I really am much more concerned about thinking about what's the will of God for me today. What's Houston Baptist University supposed to be and do? I'm committed to Christian higher education. So, you know, really, the calling of God on my life is Christian higher education. And I think the country needs institutions that are unapologetically committed to Christ, that are committed to academic excellence, that have a deep sense of free inquiry, that are not afraid of the truth, that are not just hunkered down regional religious schools, but are also not private schools that are so worried about prestige and image that they leave their heritage, their faith, and their roots. And so I think that faith and academic excellence are not a zero-sum game. Some people think that, you know, if you have more faith, then obviously academics goes down, and the more academic you are, then you've got to diminish the amount of faith. I think that's absolutely false. I think we are committed to the God of all truth. The Christian faith has nothing to fear from anyone. We can ask any question. We need not fear any question. And so, you know, we want here to have a faculty that are excellent, a faculty that are committed to Christ, a faculty that do research, that are committed to students, that teach. And by the way, you know, they not only write books and do blogs, but we play NCAA Division I football. And, you know, the reason for that, I hope that's not just an empty promo. I mean, it's because I think a university experience, young people, you asked the senator earlier about what young people experience in college and in university life. And unfortunately, universities have become places of, a kind of acculturation that is morally and socially, not just politically, but I would say morally and socially very negative. And so who your friends are, where you associate, the kinds of things you hear, what you submit yourself to, the kinds of behaviors and practices that you will find modeled all around you have an enormous influence upon you. So if you go to an institution that has co-ed dorms and the administration looks the other way with promiscuity and alcohol abuse and drugs, then it's a devastating experience for young people. I mean, here are 18-year-olds and 22-year-olds. Their hormones are raging. They're at the most influential time of their life, and we have refugees from the 1960s who are standing up as professors and talking to them. So. So that we're trying to build a great institution, again committed to Christ and unafraid of the truth, and so that's where my focus is. And in case you're tempted to ask me again, I am a sinner. I've made mistakes.
One of the many battles I lost at University of Texas was when the administration, in its wisdom, decided to put condom machines in the freshman dorms. Yeah. I assume that they're not in the freshman dorms here. Is that a valid assumption? Yeah.
I don't even want to answer that question. I hope the answer is obvious. Yeah.
And of course, I made one of the prime mistakes of a journalist in asking you a yes/no question. Yeah. Essentially, So I want to turn to some policy matters shortly, but again, I'm stressing this because it's so important for people who are known as Christians to really show that character and that combination of truth and love in our own lives and so forth. So I want to ask the yes/no question. Ted, tell me about a mistake you've made in the past 16 months.
If you were to ask my colleagues,
but they're not here,
you would get a very long list.
Ted, maybe the mistake was listening too carefully to that question.
All right.
Well, listen, I mean, we certainly have not persuaded my colleagues. And to the extent that is because of failures on my part, failures to bring them around, failures to help move them, then I certainly take the blame for that. And, I will readily admit, I've never done this before. I mean, the last 16 months ago, on January, showed up in Washington and was serving in the Senate. Prior to that, the last job I was elected to was student council. And so, there is certainly a learning the institution, learning the protocols, and, might I have said things in a different way to be more persuasive and to encourage more senators to stand up and address the problems we have in this country? I'm sure I could have.
I ran for student council and lost. You won. I also I have to confess, I was cut from my 6th grade baseball team, which led me to think I wouldn't have much of a major league career. Let's turn to some policy questions. Bob, if you were thinking of this general area of religion in American life, public life, if you were a U.S. senator, what would you? Is there something? Oh, I was almost going to ask a yes or no question. What would you do? One piece of legislation, perhaps, that you thought that you'd like to advance that might address some of the problems right now. Now that we have moved somewhat towards not a neutral situation, but a naked public square.
Yeah, no, Marvin, that's a great topic. And, the problem is that what we have is a whole set of practices that are utterly unconstitutional. And so it's hard to propose a law that's better than the First Amendment, that, Congress will make no law respecting respecting the establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. Our problem is not that we don't have enough laws. Our problem is that we have, judges and bureaucrats and others who are in positions of authority who don't enforce the laws we have or implement them in the way they're directed. So I think I would try to pursue not more laws, but try to pursue a transparency in the way things are practiced. I think when the light shines on unconstitutional practices and illegal practices, and you just sort of hold them up, you can make a real difference. So I think talking about the issues, I suppose, whatever the senators can do, hearings and promoting founding principles taught educationally, making sure that textbooks are honest about our history and so on. So again, there are many practices that I think I would try to do to promote religious freedom, because religious freedom, there is no question, is being threatened today in our culture. As you'll probably get to it later, but I mean the Obamacare HHS mandate that it's attempting to require us to provide through our insurance abortion-inducing drugs is absolutely unconscionable. It is against our religious liberty, and it is a violation of those things that we hold most dear. Well, I guess our administration just thinks that our religious views don't matter, or that they're not sincerely held, or that they can define religion, or that they're the neutral ones and we're the sectarian ones. But again, how do you improve upon the fact that Congress shall make no law prohibiting the free exercise of religion? We freely exercise our faith in the kind of insurance policies we pick, and now we have our government. We have to, Senator, it's unbelievable. We have to sue our own government on the grounds of religious freedom.
And I'm very glad that HBU won that litigation in December.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you. It's going on, but the kinds of things that senators can do to promote, judges and the right kinds of judges and that kind of process, those are the kinds of things.
Ted, if with your concerns about the diminishing role of religion in public life in many ways, if you were a university president, tell me one thing you would like to do to try to help kids to have a better understanding of things. And you're not allowed to say that you'd resign. That's not allowed. But.
Well, look, I think we need to inculcate in young people an understanding of the principles on which this country was built. And I would focus on two in particular. One, free market principles. The free enterprise system in the United States of America has been the greatest engine for prosperity and opportunity the world's ever seen. And so many of our schools, look, when I was in law school, I was at Harvard, and I was 4 years behind President Obama. And he was there. When he and I were students there, this is not an exaggeration, there were fewer professors on the Harvard faculty, on the Harvard Law School faculty, who were openly Republican than there were who were self-avowed Marxists. And it wasn't even close. There were a whole bunch of them that if you asked them, they would say they were Marxists. Now, it's funny, I made this comment some time ago, and the New Yorker magazine wrote this great profile, horror of horrors, Cruz says they're Marxist at Harvard. And you saw all these liberals and journalists, although I repeat myself, present company very much excluded.
Thank you.
But lighting their hair on fire, and I have to admit, we kind of had fun with it and posted on Facebook a simple comment that we had the clip from Casablanca. I'm shocked to find gambling.
Right.
And we just said, apparently liberals are shocked to find Marxists at Harvard. I'm glad they think that's a bad thing. But so that would be one, is teaching basic free market principles this country was built on. And related to that are the constitutional liberties, the extraordinary constitutional liberties that are foundational to this country, that are reflected in the Bill of Rights. And first and foremost is religious liberty, and how that foundation, protecting our individual liberty, has created the most incredible nation in the history of the world. And we've got to have, we can't protect those principles if young people aren't trained in them.
Let's have I don't think this will exactly be a lightning round, but maybe a jogging round with some policy issues. Cake makers, photographers, not wanting to work on same-sex weddings. And either of you can jump in on this. When you think of cake makers and photographers, similar type things, different type things, what would you do if you were in those jobs? Let's say if you ascend from the U.S. Senate to a cake maker or a photographer. So,
I'm a lousy cook.
So,
no one would buy my cakes.
Yeah. What should you do as a Christian, do you think, and what should you legally be required to do as an American?
Well, look, everyone has to reconcile their own faith with how they interact with others, and you know that's a choice you've got to make based on your understanding of biblical teachings and based on the best understanding you can come to it. You know, I'm very much a believer that the Scripture teaches that you hate the sin and love the sinner, and so you know, from my perspective, I am perfectly willing to interact with anybody. I mean, look, I work in the U.S. Congress, but at the same time, I don't think the law should be forcing Americans to violate their religious faith. Let's take an example that's currently being litigated right now, which is the Little Sisters of the Poor. Little Sisters of the Poor are a Catholic convent of nuns who have taken a vow of poverty, who spend their lives caring for the elderly, providing health care to the elderly. And the Obama administration is litigating against the Little Sisters of the Poor, trying to force them, trying to extract millions of dollars of fines to force them to pay for contraceptives and abortion-providing drugs for others. Now, these Catholic nuns don't want to do so. And the idea that the federal government would be going after Catholic nuns, trying to force them to violate their religious faith, really demonstrates how utterly unmoored we have come from the constitutional liberties this country was founded
on. Bob, if you were a photographer and asked to take photos, this was your livelihood, you're asked to take photos of a same-sex wedding, would you do so?
No.
Would you bake a cake?
But you know what? Yeah, part of the problem is that you know the government has the capacity to provide licenses. If you have to have a certain license to bake, for example, and if that license now, in my view, the license should not, having that license should not require you to violate your religious faith. And if we have laws like that, those laws ought to be opposed. But you know, as a Christian, if you have, you know, you're on the horns of a dilemma here. If there is a law, I either disobey the law or I go out of business. And so, you know, going out of business might be the right, or changing business might be the right thing to do. But you know, it's unbelievable that in our country the culture has so changed, the discourse has so changed that it's awkward for the senator in this setting. Frankly, it's awkward for me as well to have to even provide an answer like that, because these things, because they are part of the public arena, we're transparent people, I think, and so you know you're getting the unvarnished truth here. But it comes at a cost. What that says is something about the nature of our culture, that our culture has shifted so much that things that for hundreds and thousands of years with regard to marriage, for example, that marriage is between a man and a woman, that 10 years ago, it was a strange thing that it was even being contested. I mean, I remember thinking, that's crazy. Who even, I didn't even care to speak to the topic because it sounded so silly. Now, if you speak to the topic and oppose same-sex marriage, you're a hater or you're a bigot and so on. And the conversation has just shut down. There is no religious freedom. There is no freedom of speech because now there's just this immediate assumption that the debate is over, and therefore you have to be silent. So our culture has shifted, and I think one of the things we have to do. I mean, it's easy for us. I do it all the time to bemoan and lament the culture and the state of our culture. But what can we do to change our culture is, I think, imperative for all of us to think about.
Well, and I would note on that front, we just saw in recent weeks the CEO of Mozilla lose his job because he believed that 9 years ago, he believed that marriage should be between one man and one woman. And that was grounds enough to be terminated. I mean, we really are seeing an extraordinary intolerance and hostility to religious faith and to free speech. And, I would note, you take the issue in Obamacare of the contraceptive mandate. And in this, the media repeatedly and willfully misrepresents this. The issue has nothing to do with whether any individual has a right to access contraceptives. It is completely clear the answer to that is yes. There is no dispute in our society that anyone who wants to access contraceptives can do so. Heck, they can go to the University of Texas bathrooms and use the coin machines that are there. But the question is whether you or I have to give them 50 cents to go do that. And I'll make an analogy that may make more sense to our friends on the left. It's something I read in a column. Imagine you are a passionate member of PETA. You love animals.
People for the ethical treatment of animals.
Yes. And imagine, instead of Obamacare, the federal government passed a law called Obama Food. It said, we're going to ensure everyone has food, and you, as a member of PETA, must pay for meat for your employees, meat that has to be slaughtered. Now, I think people on the left can at least understand, look, if those are your beliefs, and those aren't even religious faith, but those are your profound moral beliefs, should the federal government be forcing you to pay for slaughtering animals if you strongly believe to the contrary? And that argument, at least some on the left may get, listen, this is a question, it's not about my right to eat meat. Listen, I'm a Texas carnivore. But I don't have any right to demand that you pay for my meat. And likewise, the government doesn't have a right to demand that people violate their religious faith, to pay for contraception or to pay for abortion-inducing drugs that violate the religious faith of the people they're trying to force to pay for it.
Well, let me ask, and you can tell me whether this is a thoughtful analogy or a really stupid one.
It's thoughtful.
Well, no. Just hold on a moment. We have some discussions of school choice in Texas, but it always seems to be, well, at least now you can choose. You're not stuck with necessarily a bad public school in your district. You can go to some other public school. You can go to some charter school. But here in this red state, with Republican domination of the legislature and governorship and so forth, we don't seem to have school choice as far as the opportunity for poor people to be able to send their kids to Christian schools. Now, what do you think about that, and why has Texas not been able to move on this?
I think it is an absolute outrage. I think school choice is the civil rights issue of the 21st century. And I think we need to have a real passion for kids who are trapped right now in failing schools. Education is foundational to every other to opening up opportunity, to having a chance at the American dream, and every other challenge we've got in society, whether it's poverty, whether it's crime, whether it's health care. If a kid gets an education, many of those problems will largely be addressed. And if a kid doesn't get an education, for a great many of them, we know that those problems will follow at a far too high rate. And in my view, we ought to have a passion for making sure every single child in this country, regardless of race, regardless of ethnicity, regardless of zip code or the poverty or wealth of their parents, has an opportunity to receive an excellent education. But your question is a very good one. Texas is a bright red state. Why hasn't that happened? And to be honest, there's a political failure. There's a political failure because both parties are failing on this issue. On the Democratic side, the Democrats' most important constituency for money and manpower consists of the teachers' unions. And the teachers' unions are unavoidably opposed to school choice. And as a consequence, virtually every Democratic politician is unwilling to provide hope and scholarships and opportunity for those kids. Now, here's the other side. The dirty little secret is most Republican politicians are largely apathetic on this issue. They represent often affluent suburban districts where the schools are just fine, where some of their constituents say, well, what's the problem? Our school is terrific. We don't see the issue. And so you have neither party standing up. If you look at every jurisdiction where choice programs have been implemented, you have had political leaders willing to be thrown out of office, willing to lose their position to fight for those kids. And that's what we need, is we need that kind of passion. And what choice is all about is giving low-income kids the same opportunities that the rich and middle class have always had. You know, if you take a wealthy, affluent school, let's take around the Washington, D.C. area. If you take the schools in Bethesda, Maryland, which are quite wealthy, quite affluent, if those schools had 50% dropout rates, if those schools of the kids who stayed there, half of them graduated and with basic literacy, if you had drug dealers walking the hallways, if you had children being sexually assaulted in the bathrooms, the schools in Bethesda, Maryland would be empty like that. Because the parents have the financial means to pick up and move. They can either move to another area with a public school not like that, or they can write a check to a private school to provide an alternative. And that competition protects those kids and it improves the public schools. What school choice is all about is giving low-income kids, giving African-American kids, giving Hispanic kids, giving every kid the same ability and every parent the same ability to demand an excellent education for their children.
We'll go to audience questions in just a moment, but I just want to ask Bob one thing. After World War II, with the GI Bill for higher education, at least as I understand it, folks were able to go wherever they wanted with that money. They could even go to a seminary if they wanted, anything. Would we be better off in higher education these days if we had GI Bill, if we used the governmental money for GI Bill types of things rather than a ton of money going to the University of Texas and so forth?
Well, I generally believe that when the government puts money into something, you increase the cost and you increase inefficiency. So no offense intended. So, and then, of course, the unintended consequence is you have, where there's a lot of money available for schools through students or however, then you have the unscrupulous types who develop systems who chase that money, and then you have schools that have, sign-up rates and no retention rates, no persistence rates. You have students who can't pay back their loans and so on. So you have inflated tuitions. The biggest reason for inflated tuition in American higher education today, probably two reasons. One is, I can't believe I'm going to say this, tenure. The second The second is government money that has gone into the system and made it's just like a housing bubble. Houses became so accessible that we created a housing bubble. And the same is true for higher education. When money just flies toward it from the government, then it creates a bubble. And that's why we have a tuition bubble.
Okay, where's my friend Warren Smith? There he is.
Very good. Yes, we do have some questions from the audience. The first question, Senator Cruz, directed towards you. Would you like to make news tonight and announce your candidacy for the presidency of the United States?
Well, Warren, I appreciate that incredibly kind question. Thank you. Let me just say this. I'm committed to doing everything I can to fighting alongside each and every one of you to turn this country around, because it is now or never. We have got to pull back from this cliff we're facing. We've got to get back to the Constitution, and I look forward to standing with each of you to do that.
Well, Senator, since you chose not to make news tonight with that question, and I know you hate hypotheticals, nonetheless, if you were elected President of the United States, what would you do on your first day in office? What could you do that would make a difference on the first day of office?
The very first thing the next president should do within an hour of being sworn in is repeal every single illegal executive order that President Obama has.
I think they like that answer, yeah. Dr. Sloan, a question for you, and you were getting at some of these questions around the economics of higher education and the role of government. A young lady did not ask a question, but she tweeted a comment. I'm an incoming Hispanic freshman. I need more money for college, and then she put little frowny emoticon. No question there, but obviously many questions implied. What advice, what counsel would you have for this young lady?
Well, several bits of counsel. One, obviously, you have to look at the cost of a university. One of the big problems in healthcare, I know the question's not about healthcare, but one of the big problems in healthcare is there's no transparency in the costing of it. You don't know what a hip replacement costs. Does it cost $20,000 or does it cost $120,000? And the answer is that's the spectrum in the United States, because there's no transparency in the pricing. When people know what the price of something is, they can make better judgments about it. The same is true for higher education. Now, there's some moves in this direction, but the point is that when a student sees the tuition or the retail price or the sticker price of tuition for a state school or for a private school, until you actually fill out the financial aid forms, the FAFSA form, the federal financial aid form, until you fill out the forms, until you go through the process with the schools of your choice, you don't really know exactly what the cost is. The cost is always different than the sticker price. In our case, we have a very centralized, standardized process. We use these FAFSA forms. You can go on the website, and the government has pushed schools to have greater transparency in pricing. But with scholarships and merit scholarships and need-based scholarships, it's really difficult to know. So go through the process, fill out the forms, and see what scholarships you actually qualify for. The best advice is, now if this person's already an entering college freshman, the best advice you can give someone is work hard, study, actually learn something in high school, have a good GPA, and then you will qualify for better scholarship support.
Very good. Senator Cruz, we got a lot of questions about entitlements. One question or one comment, is there any way to stop runaway entitlements? And a related question is it really fair to call something, an entitlement, something that you're entitled to, whenever the benefit over time far outstrips whatever money you've put into that particular benefit?
Well, those are both very good questions. You know, if you look at our federal budget right now, we are deep, deep, deep in a red hole, and we're getting deeper. And that is driven by entitlement spending, and it's on an unsustainable path. And in fact, last fall of 2012, I had the opportunity to give a talk at the Republican National Convention down in Tampa. And I talked about our two little girls, Caroline and Catherine. And I talked about the national debt that is driven in large part by what is happening on the entitlement side. And that night, Heidi and I got back to the hotel room. It was about 1:30 in the morning. And I pulled out my iPhone, began reading Twitter. And it so happened that Paula Poundstone, the comedian, was watching that night. And I guess she didn't have anything better to do, but she tweeted. She said, "Ted Cruz just said when his daughter was born, the national debt was $10 trillion. Now it's $16 trillion. What the heck did she do?" Which Heidi and I almost fell out of bed laughing. But Caroline is 6. In her short life, our national debt has grown over 60%. It's larger than the size of our entire economy. It's now nearly $18 trillion. In my view on entitlements, we have got to reform entitlements to save them. We've got to save Social Security and Medicare. I think what the Democrats are doing, just allowing them to careen towards insolvency, I think is profoundly irresponsible. And we ought to see meaningful leadership. I can tell you, for years, people said entitlements are the third rail of politics. You can't talk about them. Look, I campaigned for office on fundamental entitlement reform to preserve Social Security and Medicare and strengthen them. The most important piece, though, on entitlement reform is rarely discussed in connection with it, which is economic growth. If you look at our long-term budget strength, there is only one first-order variable. There is only one thing which, as it changes, has a dramatic impact on the rest of the federal budget, and that is the rate of economic growth. And it's why my top priority in office from the day I've been elected is restoring jobs and economic growth. Because for 5 years, we've been trapped in what I call the Great Stagnation. From 2008 to 2012, the economy grew 0.9% a year, less than 1% on average. If you want to save entitlements, if you want to save Social Security, if you want to save Medicare, the number one way to do so is to get back to historic levels of growth, 3, 4, 5%, unleash the American energy renaissance we're seeing, create high-paying jobs, get government out of the way, let small businesses prosper. With economic growth, entitlements with relatively few reforms become far more sustainable. With limited and stagnant growth, the entitlements fall off a cliff, and they do so very, very soon.
The worm turns, Dr. Olasky. A question for the questioner. What should the role of the press be in politics? Just an objective, disinterested observer or something else? Is the press fulfilling its role?
You know, when this country started, the Electoral College was set up because the founders had a real queasiness about direct democracy, because they figured, you know, someone could be a demagogue and the people voting for him from afar and not really seeing him up close and personal, you know, wouldn't know much about his character or whether he's trustworthy or things like that. And so the whole idea with the Electoral College was that you would vote for an elector who you knew and could have some trust in. And the elector then would vote for someone whom he had been able to observe close up. Obviously, the Electoral College doesn't work in that way anymore. And the role to me for journalists is to be able to see up close these politicians who otherwise we just know about from their mediated images on television, and in a really honest and fair way, without ideological axis to grind, be able to communicate whether this person is a person of integrity, including what's he like in his family life, what's he like, how does he act towards the people who work for him, his staffers and so forth. You see the interaction. If there's something that goes wrong on a campaign tour, does he get really impatient and start screaming at people or stuff like that? I mean, the basic stuff that you can get to know about a person. Reporters on campaign trains and planes and buses have the opportunity to see that. And it would be very valuable just to be able to, in an honest way, convey that. They would be serving somewhat of the function of the original electors. So that's what I hope would happen. When we send out world reporters, we don't really want them just to listen to a speech or even sit down and do an interview. I mean, we want them to travel around with a candidate for at least a day and get a sense of who this person is, perhaps under situations of stress. And that, I think, is a good role for reporters, and a role that when you have a reporter who's so ideologically driven that he's just going to cheer for one guy and throw mud at another guy regardless of the person's integrity or character, then he's failing in his mission as a journalist.
Dr. Sloan, there's an obvious nexus between a lot of the issues that have been discussed tonight and higher education. The inadequacies of higher education create some of the misunderstandings around politics, economy, morality, so on, that have created some of the pathologies that we're discussing tonight. However, many colleges, including Houston Baptist University, has only a very limited offering in postgraduate higher education, master's and PhD levels, which is the admission ticket for teaching at other colleges and universities. Does HBU have a plan for that, so that Christians who can get more than just an undergraduate education, but get their ticket punched so that they too could teach in higher education?
Yes, Warren, that's a great question, because one of the problems we face in Christian higher education is that you do have to have, in most instances in a given discipline, a doctorate is now the terminal degree in those disciplines. Doctorates are typically given by secular institutions, and so when we try to hire someone, the person may be a Christian, may be a church-going person, but for the last X number of years, if it's a freshly minted PhD or someone who's taught in a secular situation for a number of years, they have been trained and mentored to basically keep quiet about their faith, internalize your faith. You can go to church on Sunday, but you can't say anything in the workplace about it. And you certainly can't try to integrate what you believe as a Christian with your discipline. Don't raise any moral questions, don't raise questions of meaning or purpose in the classroom, and so on. So doctoral, freshly minted PhDs or professors from other institutions with PhDs, that's the way they've been trained. So when they come to us, they often have an intuitive, instinctive belief, a trained belief that they have to keep their faith, because we wouldn't hire them if they weren't Christians, that they have to keep their faith separate from the discipline. So one of the problems in Christian higher education is that there are very few Christian institutions that offer the highest level degrees in those various disciplines. We have a 12-year vision called the 10 Pillars, and in the 10 Pillars, our ambition is to be a comprehensive Christian university. And what that means is that we will offer doctorates. And so we are queued up now with the first several doctorates that we're already proposing and planning, and we will have those done. Our graduate school has more than doubled master's programs. We have 16 or 17 master's programs now. Our master's program, our graduate school, has more than doubled in the last 2 years. We have 700-800 graduate students now. We have 3,000 students at the university. We have a whole queue of doctoral programs, and I suspect, I hope I will see the day when we have at least 10 doctoral programs on our campus. But it's absolutely vital for... Thank you. It's vital for Christian institutions to be able to provide that kind of integration of faith so that young people can go into other institutions and teach politics and government and the Constitution and journalism and so on.
Senator Cruz, a few questions about immigration. tonight. First one, being a Republican Hispanic, why is the conservative Republican side so opposed to some sort of immigration reform when welcoming freedom lovers from around the world is a deeply ingrained characteristic of American life?
Well, I appreciate that question. And, you know, I think immigration is one of the many issues on which Washington right now is broken. If you look outside of Washington, there is widespread bipartisan agreement on many issues of immigration. There is overwhelming bipartisan agreement outside of Washington that we've got to get serious about securing our borders, that we've got to get serious about stopping the problem of illegal immigration. There is also widespread bipartisan agreement outside of Washington that we need to improve and streamline our legal immigration so that we can remain a nation that doesn't just welcome, that celebrates legal immigrants, those, as Reagan called them, Americans by choice. You know, I'm the son of an immigrant who 57 years ago fled Cuba, fled oppression, had been imprisoned, had been tortured in Cuba, and came here seeking freedom. And we need to cherish that. Every one of us shares that background, that we're the children of those who risked everything for freedom. If Congress focused on the areas of bipartisan agreement, we could craft an immigration bill that would sail through Congress, that would secure the borders, that would address and finally solve the problem of illegal immigration, and that would improve and streamline legal immigration. Unfortunately, what we've seen instead right now is immigration is mired in politics. The behavior of this White House and of the Senate Democrats, in my view, they're not interested in solving the problem. They're not interested in fixing the system and making it operate better. Instead, they're looking for partisan advantage because they believe it will help them in the elections in 2014 and 2016. And that right now is making real immigration reform that would address the problem crash on the rocks of partisan politics in Washington.
This question, I'm not sure who it's to, so anybody that has the temerity to answer it can feel free to do so. How do you respond to the assertion that same-sex marriage or marriage equality is a civil rights issue that is equal in nature to the civil rights of African Americans?
Well, thank you. I'm not running for office. I can do it. You're not either. You're clear on it. Well, it's simply not. Ethnicity, skin color is not the same thing as behavior. Same-sex behavior behavior is different. I mean, you know, this is the kind of thing that people make very superficial sort of assumptions about. And part of the assumption there is that some folk make is that sexual preferences are just as given as skin color or ethnicity, and it's simply not the case. Now, all of us as human beings may have different proclivities and tendencies. You may have a certain genetic tendency towards alcoholism. Maybe one person can endure more alcohol consumption than someone else. We all have different tendencies, but fundamentally, we're talking about a behavior. If I have a tendency towards arson or you know, theft, then yeah, I have to fight that. I have to fight that temptation more. But again, the difference is between a given of nature and a certain kind of behavior. And even though you have a proclivity towards a certain kind of behavior, as Christians, we're trying to say that, look, a man and a woman ought to enter into marriage. They ought to have a covenant together. They ought to make a marital commitment. They ought to keep that promise, and that sexual experience is a great gift and joy and pleasure and responsibility given by God that can be celebrated and should be celebrated within the confines of marriage, and anything else is actually a denigration of this very great gift of God.
I would note, by the way, a tendency towards theft might make one very well suited for politics.
Or journalism.
Actually, I think that's more in the category of arson.
Dr. Olasky, related question. If what Dr. Sloan says is true, and obviously men in the audience think so, eloquently stated, logically, rationally laid out, it seems to me that we should be winning this argument, and yet in the public square we're not. Can you say something about the role journalism/storytelling can play in the process of helping to shape the cultural narrative around some of these more troubling issues like same-sex marriage?
Oh, sure. Journalists try to put a face on a story. There's a thing that we teach about called the ladder of abstraction. And the goal is always to be pretty low on the ladder, dealing with human beings and their particular plights, as opposed to abstract things. And that works well for us, at least for Christian journalists in some areas, for example, on abortion. The other side likes to talk about pro-choice. I mean, way high up in the ladder of abstraction. And we talk about babies and can show pictures of babies whose lives are saved by pregnancy resource centers. So, there you stay low on the ladder of abstraction. When it comes to same-sex marriage, basically, the liberal journalists have been very adept at finding highly sympathetic people and people who love each other and want to be together. And gee, who's going to be against that except someone who, at least in the typical journalist slant, has, some homophobia or something. So the liberal journalists have been extraordinarily successful at presenting people in love. And who's going to be against love? That's essentially why that side is winning.
I'm afraid this is going to have to be our last question for the evening. Dr. Sloan, it will go to you as our host. And first of all, thank you so much for hosting us tonight. It's been a great evening. And
Thanks. Thank you. Thank you.
And it brings us somewhat full circle, given the topic for tonight, religion in the public square, faith in the public square. If atheism was a religion, it would be one of the fastest, if not the fastest, growing religion on the planet. I know HBU has made a particular commitment to Christian apologetics. Can you say a few words about Christian apologetics and its role in shaping the public conversation and what HBU's goals are in that arena for the future?
Thanks very much. Well, yes, one is I don't think atheism is one of the fastest growing religions on the face of the earth. Maybe religious indifference might be, but people, we are made by God, and there is a longing for God in the human heart, and so I think to be an atheist requires an extraordinary suspension of mind and will to be an atheist. That's another story. But we have an apologetics program. You've probably heard of Lee Strobel, who's I think the most popular speaker on the English-speaking circuit today. He's now affiliated with us as a faculty member. We also have William Lane Craig. Bill Craig has been called by Lee Strobel the most brilliant Christian mind in the world today. He also is affiliated with us as a faculty member. We have other fabulous faculty members in cultural apologetics and philosophical apologetics. We have people like Jerry Walls and Mike Lacona and Mary Jo Sharp and Holly Ordway. And I shouldn't have started. Did I say Mike Lacona? We have quite a few who are just brilliant philosophers and apologists and theologians. And so we have, this is not boasting, we have the finest apologetics program in America. The word apologetics does not mean to apologize. It's a word that means to defend, and it means to argue for and defend the Christian faith. I think it went out of vogue for a while in Christian schools, but it's back in vogue because the great secularism of our day. People realize that with the multiculturalism, with the proliferation of visibility of other religions besides the Christian faith, for example, in our own culture, and that it's important for people to know what they believe and why they believe and how to articulate that. Apologetics or the Christian faith, no one in the Christian faith, you cannot coerce another person to be a Christian. It would be a contradiction in terms to do that. But Christians ought to articulately and faithfully and intelligently and humbly set forth the case for why we believe that the God of Scripture is the Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, that He was crucified for the sins of humanity and has been, in fact, raised from the dead and is the everlasting Lord of the universe to whom every knee one day will bow. That's what we believe. That's what we confess. And so apologists set forth that case. So if anyone in our audience is interested in studying how to defend the faith, we have a master's program now in apologetics. One of these days we'll have a doctoral program in it. We have just the finest faculty, I think, in the world in that regard. Thanks for asking the question.
Yep. Dr. Olasky?
I just wanted to say that I really appreciate what HBU is doing and the way it's growing, because, and this ties into this last question about same-sex marriage, I think if we fight it on that issue alone, we're going to continue to lose. The real question is, what does God say? What does the Bible say? And the way to fight on that issue and every other issue is to try to bring people as best we can with God's grace to a deeper understanding of what the Bible says. And that's why the whole battle concerning evolution versus intelligent design is so important and so crucial and so fundamental. Because if we're just material, sure, same-sex marriage, this. But if the Bible is actually God's word and He created us and this whole universe, then, that's what we have to live by. Difficult as it may be at times in the public arena, in the journalistic arena, that's where we are. That's our only hope in Christ. And my request to Ted is that he read Goodnight Moon on the floor of the Senate.
Well, let me briefly echo the comments of both of these gentlemen and thank HBU for hosting this and for the tremendous job you do.
Thank you. Very kind. Thank you. Thanks for being here.
I am blessed to be the product of Christian education. And I'm a proud graduate in Houston of Second Baptist High School. And indeed, my sister attended for 2 years HBU. And I am grateful for the work y'all do every day, helping train young people, helping train them academically, but also helping strengthen their faith, strengthen their walk with Christ, and strengthen their ability to stand and witness to others. It makes a difference in our community, it makes a difference in our state, it makes a difference in our nation, and I just want to thank you, and I want to thank all of you for being here and for standing for your principles.
Thank you.
Thank all of you.